Families are meant to be bound by love, but sometimes the very ties that hold us together become the sharpest knives. This is the story of Harold Whitmore, a man who spent his entire life building not just a house, but a home, a place where generations could laugh, fight, celebrate, and heal under the same roof. Yet in one evening, at a family dinner filled with laughter and clinking glasses, everything he had given seemed to vanish with a single cruel sentence. "You're not family." The words came not from a stranger, but from Ethan, his own grandson. And worse, no one rose to defend him. Not his son, not his daughter-in-law, not the relatives gathered around the oak table he had built with his own hands. In that moment, Harold wasn't just humiliated, he was erased. The Whitmore farmhouse sat on the edge of Willow Creek, its wide porch sagging slightly under the weight of years. Built in 1948 by Harold's father, the house wasn't just lumber and nails, it was memory, history, and sacrifice. To outsiders, it looked like any other old farmhouse, with peeling white paint and a stubborn roof that always seemed to need fixing. But to Harold Whitmore, it was sacred ground. At 74, Harold moved slower than he used to, but he still rose before dawn. His hands were scarred, knuckles thick from decades of farm work, but he kept them steady as he buttoned his faded flannel shirt. The house was quiet, too quiet, and that silence weighed on him. Once upon a time, laughter had spilled through every room, his wife humming in the kitchen, his children running across the wooden floors. Now, only the hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of a wall clock accompanied his mornings. Harold shuffled to the porch with his cane, lowering himself into the rocking chair that faced the fields. Rows of corn stretched as far as his eyes could see, the stalks trembling in the morning breeze. He closed his eyes, inhaling the cool air. "Still standing," he muttered to himself. The words were about the house, the land, and maybe about him, too. It had been 12 years since Martha, his wife, passed away. 12 years since the woman who had balanced his temper and softened his rough edges had left him to manage not only the farm but also the fragile bonds of their family. Harold wasn't perfect. He was stubborn, proud, sometimes harsh with his words, but Martha had always been the glue. Without her, cracks had widened. His son, Richard, rarely visited except on holidays. His daughter-in-law, Elaine, was polite but distant, always seeming to find a way to remind Harold that the house belonged to the future generation now. And his grandson, Ethan, the boy Harold had once carried on his shoulders during summer fairs, looked at him as if he were a relic, something old and inconvenient. Only Emily, his granddaughter, still treated him with warmth, sneaking into the farmhouse after school to share tea and stories. This morning, as Harold sipped black coffee from a chipped mug, he thought about the upcoming family dinner Elaine had organized. She had insisted on hosting it at the farmhouse for old times' sake, though Harold suspected her reasons were less sentimental. He had heard whispers, snippets of conversation cut short when he entered the room. Something about papers and the deed. His late wife's will had been clear. The farm remained in Harold's care until his passing. Only then would it be divided. Still, he could sense the hunger in Elaine's voice whenever she mentioned the property. The silence of the porch was broken by the sound of tires on gravel. A car pulled up, sleek and black against the dust of the driveway. Harold recognized it instantly. Richard's. He straightened in his chair, heart tightening in a mix of pride and unease. Richard stepped out first, tall and broad-shouldered, his suit too polished for country air. Elaine followed, immaculate in a cream blouse and diamond earrings that caught the light. Ethan emerged from the back seat, phone in hand, his eyes never lifting from the glowing screen. Emily was last, her hair tied in a messy braid, her smile warm as ever. "Dad?" Richard greeted, adjusting his tie as if the fields themselves were judging him. "Morning," Harold replied, his voice gravelly but steady. He nodded toward Emily, who broke from the group and hugged him tightly. "I missed you, Grandpa," she whispered. That single sentence was enough to soften the ache in Harold's chest. He patted her back, then looked over her shoulder at Ethan, who still hadn't looked up. "And you, boy, can't tear yourself away from that thing long enough to say hello?" Harold teased, though there was an edge beneath his tone. Ethan sighed dramatically, sliding his phone into his pocket. "Hey, Grandpa," he said flatly. Elaine smoothed her blouse, her eyes scanning the porch. "The house looks quaint," she said, forcing a smile. "I suppose it hasn't changed much." "It wasn't built to change," Harold replied. "It was built to last." They entered the house together, the air thick with tension masked as civility. Elaine moved through the kitchen like an inspector, her eyes tracing the worn counters and chipped cabinets. Richard busied himself with his phone calls, pacing near the window. Ethan sprawled on the couch, earbuds dangling. Only Emily followed Harold into the kitchen, helping him set the table. "You know they don't appreciate it the way you do," Harold murmured, keeping his voice low. Emily glanced toward the living room before whispering back. "I know. But I do. This house means something. And so do you." Her words nearly undid him. For a moment, Harold felt seen not as a burden, not as an old man clinging to the past, but as the foundation of something still worth holding on to. By evening, the table was set. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, corn from Harold's fields, all prepared with Emily's eager hands guiding his slower ones. The family gathered, glasses raised in a toast that felt more performative than sincere. Conversation was polite at first. Richard spoke of business ventures. Elaine recounted a charity luncheon. Ethan muttered about college applications. Then came the silence, that heavy, suffocating silence that always arrived when someone decided to speak truth. Elaine was the one who broke it. "Harold," she began, her tone honeyed but sharp, "have you thought about what happens next? With the farm, I mean. It's such a large property. Maintaining it must be difficult at your age." Harold set his fork down slowly, his eyes narrowing. "The farm will be here as long as I am. That was your mother-in-law's wish, and it's mine too." Ethan rolled his eyes. "Grandpa, come on. You can't run this place forever. You're old. It doesn't make sense for you to hold on to it when Dad could be using it to actually make money." The words cut deeper than Harold expected, not just because of their cruelty, but because of the casualness, the way Ethan dismissed his life's work as if it were nothing more than an inconvenience. For a long moment, no one spoke. Richard cleared his throat but said nothing. Elaine sipped her wine. Emily's hand found Harold's under the table, squeezing gently. "You're not family," Ethan muttered under his breath, not realizing Harold heard every word. The knife didn't come from a stranger. It came from blood. Harold's chest tightened, but he forced himself to sit tall. He looked at each of them, memorizing their faces. The dinner continued, words spilling carelessly, but Harold's mind had already shifted. He knew something now, something unshakable. The people at his table didn't see him as the foundation anymore. They saw him as an obstacle. But what none of them realized was that Harold held more than memories. He held deeds, letters, and truths buried deeper than any of them could imagine. And if they wanted a fight for the soul of the Whitmore farm, they would get one. The following morning began like many others for Harold, yet it carried the aftertaste of last night's words. Ethan's voice echoed in his mind. "You're not family." The sentence clung to him like smoke that refused to dissipate. Harold woke before dawn, as he always did, though sleep had been restless. His dreams were tangled webs of Martha's laughter and Ethan's dismissive scowl. He rubbed his eyes, groaning as his bones reminded him of the years that had piled up. Still, he swung his legs over the edge of the bed and forced his body upright. The farm demanded it. The kitchen smelled faintly of last night's dinner. Plates had been cleared, but Elaine's perfume still lingered in the air, sharp and cloying. Harold brewed coffee slowly, each movement deliberate, almost ceremonial. The house was still quiet, his guests were sleeping in, no doubt wrapped in their city-bought comfort. Harold shook his head. When he was Ethan's age, he'd already spent 5 summers rising before the sun to milk cows, cut hay, and mend fences. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Harold stepped outside. Dew clung to the grass, and the fields stretched endless and silent before him. For a moment, peace settled over his chest. The land hadn't betrayed him, not yet. Every stalk of corn, every post in the fence still stood as proof of his labor. But the peace was short-lived. The screen door creaked, and Richard emerged, rubbing his temples. "Dad," he muttered, voice groggy. "We need to talk." Harold didn't look at him right away. Instead, he leaned on his cane and stared at the horizon. "About the farm, I reckon?" Richard hesitated. "Yes. Look, I know you're proud of what you built here, but times are different now. The land could be worth a fortune if we sold it to developers. You could live comfortably for the rest of your life, without worrying about upkeep." Harold turned slowly, his eyes sharp. "Comfortably? You think I want comfort? I had comfort. Her name was Martha. What I want is purpose. And this land still gives me that." Richard sighed, exasperated. "Dad, listen to yourself. You're 74. You're not invincible. What happens if something happens to you out here alone?" "Then I die doing what I was meant to do," Harold snapped, his voice rising. "Better that than living like a guest in some nursing home while vultures pick apart my legacy." Richard's jaw tightened. "This isn't just about you. It's about family." That word again, family. Harold almost laughed at the irony. Family doesn't cast out its own. Family doesn't call their grandfather useless. The silence between them thickened. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but footsteps interrupted them. Elaine appeared, dressed impeccably even at sunrise, holding a steaming mug of coffee. "Are we starting this again so early?" she asked, feigning patience but dripping with annoyance. "Harold, no one is trying to disrespect you. We just want what's best for everyone." "For everyone?" Harold's voice was low, almost dangerous. "Or for yourselves?" Elaine didn't flinch. She had a knack for hiding venom beneath politeness. "You can't deny it's unreasonable for you to keep clinging to this place. You could make a generous contribution to Ethan's education. Imagine what Martha would have wanted for her grandson." Harold's heart clenched at the mention of Martha. Using her name like currency was unforgivable. His knuckles whitened around the handle of his cane. Martha wanted love in this house. Respect. You remember her, don't you, Elaine? Or are you too busy counting dollars in your head? Elaine's lips tightened into a thin line, but she said nothing. The standoff was broken by the sound of laughter, Emily's laughter floating from the barn. She'd risen early, slipping away while the others argued. Harold exhaled, some of the bitterness leaving his chest. "Go back inside," he muttered to Richard and Elaine. "I need air." They obeyed, though uneasily. Harold made his way to the barn, his cane tapping the ground with each step. When he reached the door, he paused, listening. Emily was humming to herself as she brushed down one of the old horses, her braid swinging as she worked. "Morning, Grandpa," she said brightly when she noticed him. "He still remembers me." She patted the horse's neck. Harold smiled faintly. "Of course he does. Animals remember kindness better than people do." Emily's brow furrowed. She studied his face, reading the tension etched there. "They upset you again, didn't they?" Harold nodded, though he tried to shrug it off. "It's nothing I can't handle." But Emily wasn't convinced. "Grandpa, you know they don't see things the way we do. To them, this place is just land. To you, it's home. To me, too. I wish they understood. Her words warmed him, but they also deepened his sorrow. One day, Emily, they'll understand, maybe when it's too late. Emily fell quiet, stroking the horse's mane. Then, hesitantly, she asked, "What will happen when you're gone?" The question pierced him. He wanted to lie, to tell her everything would be fine, but Harold had always believed in truth, even when it hurt. "I've made plans," he said carefully. "The kind your father and Elaine wouldn't expect. But for now, that's between me and the Lord." Ugh. Emily's eyes widened, curiosity sparking, but Harold said no more. Some secrets were safer in silence. That night, tension at the dinner table returned. Ethan barely glanced up from his phone, grumbling when Harold asked him to help set the plates. Elaine offered backhanded compliments about the rustic charm of the house. Richard tried to play mediator, though his patience was thinning. At one point, Harold caught Ethan whispering something to Elaine. He didn't hear it all, but one word reached his ears clear as a bell. Inheritance. Harold's stomach turned. They weren't even pretending anymore. Later, alone in his room, Harold unlocked the small wooden chest beneath his bed. Inside were yellowed letters, Martha's wedding ring, and a set of legal documents few people knew existed. He traced his fingers over the deed, the ink slightly faded but still binding. He thought of Emily's face, her loyalty shining against the darkness of the others. "Not yet," he whispered to the papers, "but soon." As he closed the chest, Harold felt something stir inside him. Not despair, not fear, but resolve. If his family wanted to push him aside, they would learn that the old man they underestimated still held the power to change everything. The cracks in the foundation were widening, and Harold knew the storm was coming. The following afternoon carried with it an oppressive stillness. The August heat pressed down on the farm like a suffocating blanket, thick with cicada song and the smell of drying hay. Harold had tried to keep busy patching a broken hinge on the chicken coop, inspecting the corn rows, but his joints screamed with each movement. Eventually, he surrendered to the cool shadows of the farmhouse, where memories seemed to hang in the air as tangibly as the dust motes floating in the sunlight. He moved slowly up the creaking staircase. The second floor of the farmhouse was quieter than the first, where Richard and Elaine bickered in low voices behind closed doors, and Ethan played music loud enough to bleed through the thin walls. Emily had disappeared again, likely wandering the fields with the same adventurous spirit Harold had once seen in her grandmother. At the top of the stairs, Harold paused. His gaze fell on the narrow door at the end of the hall. The attic. He hadn't opened it in years, not since Martha's things had been carefully boxed away after her passing. For a long moment, he stood frozen, hand hovering over the knob. His breath caught in his chest. Finally, with a heavy exhale, he twisted it open. The stairs groaned as he climbed. The attic air was stale, scented faintly of cedar and mothballs. A single bulb hung overhead, dim but enough to cast long shadows over the collection of forgotten boxes, furniture draped in sheets, and trunks lined against the far wall. Harold's cane tapped the floor as he made his way to a large cedar chest he had nearly forgotten. He lowered himself carefully, resting on the chest's edge. With a grunt, he lifted the lid. Inside lay remnants of another life. Martha's shawls, her favorite recipe cards written in delicate script, photo albums swollen with time. Harold's hands trembled as he pulled one album free. Dust scattered in the air. He flipped through the pages slowly, Martha smiling in a sundress, Richard as a boy sitting on Harold's shoulders, Emily as a toddler giggling with cake smeared across her cheeks. Each picture was a dagger of sweetness and sorrow. Then his eyes landed on something else. a faded envelope tucked between the pages. His name was written across the front in Martha's graceful handwriting. Heart-pounding, Harold slid it free and unfolded the brittle paper. "My dearest Harold," the letter began. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone. Please do not grieve too long. Remember me with laughter as much as with tears. I know our family will not always see eye to eye. Richard is stubborn like you, and Ethan is still so young. But Harold, promise me you will protect the farm. It is not just dirt and wood. It is the soul of everything we build together. If there is one thing you pass down, let it be this land, preserved with love and dignity. Even if they don't understand now, one day they will." Harold pressed the letter to his lips, eyes wet. Her voice, her love, it was all here, guiding him even after death. And then he made a decision. Martha had trusted him, and he would not fail her. He tucked the letter back into its envelope and placed it in the chest where he kept the deed. Tonight, when the others were asleep, he would draft an addition to his will, one they would never expect. Emily, the only one who truly saw the land for what it was, would inherit the farm. The rest would have their comforts, their city lives, their ambitions. But this soil would stay in the hands of someone who loved it. Downstairs, life carried on with an eerie normalcy. Elaine was on the phone, her tone sharp and rehearsed, as if she were speaking with a realtor. Harold paused in the stairwell, listening. "Yes," Elaine said. "The property is still tied up, but once Dad agrees to sell, we could move quickly. Developers are eager to buy farmland in this area. It would be foolish not to what?" "Oh, don't worry. I'll handle Harold. He's sentimental, but he'll come around." Harold's blood turned to ice. He gripped the railing so tightly his knuckles whitened. They were planning without him, already counting money that wasn't theirs to claim. He made his way back to his room quietly, anger simmering beneath the surface. He sat at his desk and opened a leather-bound journal Martha had once given him. Normally, he wrote prayers or notes about the weather, but tonight his pen scratched with renewed purpose. "To whom it may concern," he wrote, "I, Harold Whitmore, being of sound mind and judgment, hereby declare that upon my passing, the family farm shall not be sold, divided, or developed under any circumstance. Ownership shall pass solely to my granddaughter, Emily Whitmore, whom I trust to honor the legacy of this land. This is my will, my vow, and my last defense of all I have built with Martha." The words brought him a strange comfort, as though Martha herself were guiding his hand. He hid the journal beneath the chest once more. As night fell, thunder rolled in the distance. Harold lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creak of the old house and the hushed voices of his family down the hall. He knew what was coming. The battle lines had been drawn, even if they didn't realize it yet. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm within these walls. The next morning, Emily found him sitting on the porch, staring at the horizon. "You were up late," she said, joining him. "I saw your light." Harold nodded, but said nothing. His eyes were weary, yet firm. "Grandpa," Emily whispered, almost conspiratorial. "Whatever you're planning, I want to help." Harold turned to her, truly seeing her in that moment, not just as a granddaughter, but as the future. "One day, Emily," he said softly, "you'll understand everything. For now, just promise me one thing." She tilted her head. "What's that?" He reached over, squeezing her hand. "Promise me you'll never let them take this land without a fight." Emily hesitated, then tightened her grip. "I promise." Harold's chest loosened. For the first time in days, he allowed himself a smile. But upstairs, behind closed doors, Elaine and Richard were having a different conversation. "He's getting worse," Elaine said, her voice sharp. "Stubborn. He'll never sign." Richard rubbed his temples. So what do you want me to do? Force him? Elaine's eyes hardened. If he won't see reason, then maybe it's time we stop asking. Neither of them noticed Ethan standing in the hall, listening. A smirk tugged at the corners of his mouth. He'd been bored with farm life until now, but the promise of a fortune had awakened something else in him. And as Harold stared across his fields, savoring the beauty of what he and Martha had built, he couldn't shake the chill crawling up his spine. The storm clouds were gathering. The farmhouse carried an uneasy silence in the following days. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. Harold once loved the hush of wind weaving through cornstalks, the hum of bees in the orchard. No, this silence was brittle, stretched thin like glass ready to shatter. Every conversation seemed forced, every shared meal a performance. Harold noticed things. He always noticed things. The way Richard avoided his eyes when talk of finances came up. The way Elaine's phone never left her hand, her hushed whispers echoing from the den. Even Ethan, who once rolled his eyes at the farm chores, suddenly seemed interested in every corner of the land, pacing the fields as if measuring them with his footsteps. It was Martha's letter that kept Harold steady. He carried it in his breast pocket now, folded neatly, like a talisman. When doubt gnawed at him, when pain in his joints nearly forced him to surrender, he touched the paper and remembered, this is what we built. This is what we promised. On a Thursday afternoon, the family gathered for supper. Elaine had cooked, though Harold barely tasted the food, his thoughts were elsewhere. The sound of forks on plates filled the air, interrupted only by the occasional murmur. Richard cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Dad," he began cautiously, "we need to talk about the future." Harold's jaw tightened. "Future's already here. What's there to talk about?" Richard glanced at Elaine before pressing on. "You're not as strong as you used to be. Running the farm alone isn't practical. Selling would give you comfort. You wouldn't have to worry about upkeep, bills, or—" "I said no," Harold interrupted, his voice sharp. Elaine leaned forward, her smile practiced but cold. "Harold, you can't be stubborn forever. Think of what's best for everyone. This farm could set us up for life." Harold slammed his hand against the table. The dishes rattled. "Best for everyone, or best for yourselves?" The air grew heavy. Ethan chuckled quietly, earning a glare from his father. Emily's eyes darted between them, fear written across her face. "No one's trying to hurt you," Richard said, though his tone lacked conviction. "We just want to move on. This place, it's outdated. The world's changing. Dad." Harold leaned in, his voice low and dangerous. "This land doesn't belong to the world. It belongs to us, to your mother and me. And one day, it will belong to Emily." The room went still. Elaine's fork clattered onto her plate. "Emily?" she spat. "You can't be serious." "She's the only one who cares," Harold shot back. "The only one who sees this place for what it is, not a pile of money, but a legacy." Richard's face darkened, veins visible in his temple. "That's not your decision to make alone." Harold stood, gripping the back of his chair for balance. "As long as I'm breathing, it is." Without another word, he walked out, the screen door banging shut behind him. The evening air was cooler, a soft breeze carrying the scent of alfalfa. Harold's chest rose and fell in heavy breaths as he stared at the fields, their golden waves bending under the twilight sky. For decades, he'd worked this soil, planting and harvesting, sweating and bleeding. It wasn't just land, it was him. Footsteps behind him broke the silence. Emily's small hand slipped into his. "Grandpa," she whispered, "you don't have to fight them alone." Harold's throat tightened. He squeezed her hand, grateful for her quiet strength. "They don't understand," he murmured. But you do. Promise me again. Emily, promise me you'll protect it. I promise, she said, fierce despite her youth. Inside, however, another storm was brewing. Richard and Elaine's hushed voices echoed from the kitchen. This is insane, Elaine hissed. He's giving it to her. Richard paced, rubbing his temples. We'll challenge it. A will can be changed. He's not thinking clearly, age is catching up with him. Elaine's eyes narrowed. Then maybe we shouldn't wait for him to change it. Maybe we make the decision for him. Richard froze. You mean, she whispered. There are ways to push him, to make him sign. He's fragile. A little pressure, a little persuasion. He won't stand a chance. Neither of them noticed Ethan leaning casually in the doorway, arms crossed. He smirked. You two are amateurs, he said. If you want him to cave, you need me. Richard scowled. Stay out of this, Ethan. But Ethan only shrugged, his grin widening. I'm just saying, Grandpa trusts me more than you think. If I play along, I could make him doubt himself. Make him think selling's his idea. Then we all win. Elaine exchanged a look with Richard, her lips curving into a cold smile. For the first time, the three of them shared the same thought. And upstairs, unaware of the whispers below, Harold sat at his desk, pen scratching against paper as he wrote Emily another letter. His hand trembled, but his resolve was steady. He would not bend. Not to Richard, not to Elaine, not even to Ethan. But as the moon rose high over the farmhouse, casting its pale glow across the sleeping fields, Harold couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that his family was already moving against him. And he was right. The next morning, Harold rose early, as he always had. His body ached, every joint screaming in protest. But habit pushed him forward. He moved through the kitchen in silence, boiling water for his coffee, the aroma filling the air like an old friend. For a moment, it almost felt like Martha was still there, humming softly as she kneaded bread dough. But reality was harsher. Her chair at the table remained empty, a hollow reminder of all he had lost. Harold sat with his mug, staring at the sunrise painting the horizon, and for the first time in a long while, he wondered if Richard was right. Was he holding on too tightly? Was he forcing Emily to carry a burden too heavy for her young shoulders? No, he banished the thought as quickly as it came. Martha's words in her letter weren't the ramblings of a sentimental heart. They were a promise. Harold swore to himself he would not betray that promise. Down the hall, Richard and Elaine whispered in their bedroom. Elaine's voice carried a sharp edge, like glass. We can't let him put everything in Emily's name. She's just a child. She's not just a child, Richard muttered. She's his favorite. That makes her dangerous. Elaine crossed her arms. Then we make her less dangerous. You know what they say, children believe what they're told. If she thinks her grandpa's losing his mind, she won't side with him. She'll side with us. Richard frowned. You'd pit her against him? Elaine's eyes gleamed. Not pit, persuade. By noon, Harold was out in the barn, fixing a broken latch on the stall door. The sun was high, heat settling over the farm like a heavy blanket. He wiped sweat from his brow when Ethan strolled in, hands in his pockets, that sly grin plastered on his face. Grandpa, Ethan drawled. You ever think maybe you're working too hard? Harold didn't look up. Work keeps me alive. Or it kills you faster, Ethan shot back. Come on, selling the farm wouldn't be the end of the world. You could move into town, live easy, buy a new truck, eat out every night. Doesn't that sound better than sweating over rusted tools? Harold tightened the screw on the latch, his hand steady despite the heat of anger rising in his chest. This place is worth more than trucks and restaurants. You wouldn't understand. Ethan smirked. Maybe I'd understand if you gave me a reason. Right now, it just looks like you're chained to dirt and old memories. Harold turned, his gaze hard. This dirt fed your father, fed you, fed every generation before you. It's not chains, it's roots, and without roots, a tree falls. Ethan laughed, shaking his head. You sound like a preacher, but trees rot, Grandpa. And yours? It's already crumbling. Harold's chest tightened, though he refused to let Ethan see the pain behind his words. Get out of my barn! Ethan raised his hands in mock surrender, grinning as he walked away. Suit yourself, but don't be surprised when the tree comes down. That evening, Emily found Harold sitting on the porch, staring at the fields as twilight settled. She climbed onto the rocking chair beside him, her small legs dangling. Grandpa, she said softly, are you okay? Harold managed a weary smile. I've seen better days, sweetheart, but I'll be fine. Emily leaned against him. I heard Dad and Grandma talking. They don't want you to keep the farm. They said you're confused. Harold's heart clenched. So Elaine's plan was already in motion. He stroked Emily's hair, steadying his voice. I may be old, Emily, but I'm not confused. Don't let them trick you into thinking otherwise. Do you believe me? Emily nodded firmly. Always. Tears stung Harold's eyes. In that moment, her faith was the only shield he had against the storm brewing inside his own home. Later that night, Richard sat in the den, papers spread across the coffee table. Contracts, letters, and a business card from a real estate developer. Elaine sat across from him, sipping wine. They're offering more than fair market value, Richard said. We could walk away with enough to buy 2 houses in the city and still have money left. Elaine smiled, swirling her glass. And Harold? What about his precious legacy? Richard's jaw tightened. If he won't sign willingly, we'll make him. Ethan strolled in, tossing a baseball casually in one hand. You two keep scheming, but you'll need me. Grandpa listens to me more than you think. I'll soften him up. Elaine tilted her head, intrigued. And what do you want in return? Ethan caught the ball, smirking. My share, more than Emily. I don't care about the farm, but I want my cut. Richard scowled. You'll get what's fair. Ethan leaned forward, his voice cold. Fair? Number, I want what I deserve. Elaine studied him for a moment, then laughed softly. Maybe you're more like us than I realized. The 3 of them shared a look, their alliance sealed in the shadows of the den. Upstairs, Harold sat at his desk again, writing by the dim glow of the lamp. His hand shook as he wrote Emily's name at the top of the page. Emily, the world will try to make you doubt me. They'll say I'm old, that I've lost my mind. But remember this, the truth doesn't change just because people stop believing it. This land is yours not because of money, but because it carries the weight of our family. When I'm gone, you'll understand why I fought so hard. He paused, staring at the words. For the first time, fear crept in. Not fear of death, but fear of being erased, of having his life's work reduced to nothing more than a signature on a contract. And downstairs, Richard, Elaine, and Ethan sharpened their knives not of steel, but of betrayal, manipulation, and greed. The poison had seeped into the roots of the family tree, and Harold knew it was only a matter of time before it reached the trunk. The following week began with a suffocating stillness on the farm. Harold woke before dawn, as he always did, the ache in his back and knees sharper than usual. He shuffled into the kitchen, the boards creaking under his weight. Emily had drawn a little picture the night before, a tree with long twisting roots pinned proudly to the fridge. Harold smiled faintly at it. To her, the farm wasn't just a place. It was alive, like family. He poured himself coffee, the rich aroma filling the room. But before he could take a sip, Elaine walked in, her silk robe brushing the floor. She looked out of place here, like a queen in a barnyard. "You shouldn't be up so early," she said coolly. "It's not good for your health." Harold raised an eyebrow. "I've been rising before the sun for 70 years. I'll live." Elaine moved closer, lowering her voice. "Richard's worried about you. We all are. You've been forgetful." Harold's hand tightened around his mug. "I may forget where I left my glasses, Elaine, but I haven't forgotten who I am or what this farm means." Elaine gave a thin smile. "That's not what people will see. You should think about letting someone else take responsibility, for Emily's sake." Harold didn't answer. He saw it clearly now. The smile wasn't concern. It was strategy. Later that day, Richard invited Harold into town under the pretense of having lunch. They drove in tense silence, the old truck rattling along the highway. Richard parked outside a cafe, but instead of going in, he led Harold next door to a lawyer's office. Harold stopped at the door. "What's this?" "This," Richard gave an easy smile, too polished to be honest. "Just a small matter of paperwork. Updating your will, making sure everything's in order. You want Emily protected, don't you?" Harold's chest tightened. "I already wrote my will." "Yes, but it's outdated," Richard pressed. "Things change. Laws change. You don't want the farm tied up in probate courts. A signature today could save Emily years of headaches later." Harold stared at him, the pit of his stomach twisting. Richard's words were rehearsed, too smooth. He'd been waiting for this moment. "I'll think about it," Harold said flatly. He turned back toward the truck, each step heavy with defiance. Richard followed, his smile cracking. "Dad, don't make this harder than it has to be. You're being unreasonable." Harold gripped the truck's door handle. "Unreasonable is selling your soul for comfort. I won't do it." For the first time, Richard's mask slipped, his voice sharp. "You'll regret this." That night, Harold sat on the porch with Emily. The stars glimmered above them, the air thick with the scent of cut grass. Emily held her sketchpad on her lap, drawing the barn. "Grandpa," she said softly, "why was Dad so angry today?" Harold sighed, his chest heavy. "Because I told him no." Emily frowned. "No to what?" "To giving up what matters most." She looked down at her drawing, chewing her lip. "I don't understand. Isn't family supposed to be more important than money?" Harold's throat tightened. He wished he could shield her from the ugliness, but she deserved the truth. Sometimes people forget what family means. They think money can replace it, but it never can. Emily leaned against him, silent for a while. Then she whispered, "I'll never forget." Harold kissed the top of her head. "That's why I believe in you." Meanwhile, in the den, Richard, Elaine, and Ethan sat in a circle, the lamplight casting sharp shadows across their faces. "He won't sign," Richard muttered, pacing. "He's stubborn as a mule." Ethan smirked. "So make him sign. Old people trust doctors, don't they? Get one to say he's losing it." Elaine leaned forward, her eyes glinting. "That could work. If we can convince the court he's unfit, control of the estate shifts. Richard, you'd be executor. You'd decide what happens." Richard hesitated. "He'd hate me for it." Elaine's lips curled. "He already does. The question is, do you want to spend the rest of your life living in his shadow, or finally take what you deserve?" Ethan tossed his baseball in the air. "Sounds like a win to me. Grandpa can't fight forever. Age is on our side." Richard rubbed his temples. His conscience was thinning, but greed whispered louder. He nodded slowly. "All right, we'll talk to Dr. Simons. If we can get a statement about Dad's mental health, the rest falls into place." 2 days later, Harold felt the trap closing. Dr. Simons, his longtime physician, came to the farm for a routine checkup. Harold sat stiffly in the living room while Richard hovered nearby. The doctor asked question after question, memory tests, orientation checks, cognitive riddles. Harold answered each one clearly, his voice firm. But Richard interrupted often, pointing out harmless mistakes. "See, Dad, you forgot the date again," Richard said. Harold shot him a glare. "I don't need to know the date to run this farm." Still, Harold saw it in Dr. Simon's eyes. A seed of doubt had been planted, and it was Richard's hand that buried it deep. That night, Harold couldn't sleep. He wandered the house, his footsteps echoing through the hall. The portraits on the wall seemed to watch him, generations of marshals, stern and unyielding. He paused at Martha's photo, tracing the frame with trembling fingers. "They're coming for it, Martha," he whispered. "For everything we built, and they'll tear it apart if I can't stop them." Outside his window, the fields stretched under moonlight, vast and silent. Harold clenched his fists. He wasn't ready to surrender, not to Richard, not to Elaine, not even to time itself. But deep in his bones, he felt the first strike had already landed. The war for the farm had begun. The morning sun spilled across the fields, golden and serene, but Harold felt no peace. Every step he took toward the barn seemed heavier, like the earth itself resisted him. The events of the last few days weighed on his shoulders, Richard's manipulation, Elaine's sly hints, Dr. Simon's prying questions. The farm had always been his fortress, but now it felt like enemy territory. Inside the barn, Harold busied himself with the horses, running his calloused hands over their flanks. They still trusted him. They didn't doubt his strength, his memory, or his worth, unlike his own son. As he worked, Emily skipped in, her sketchpad tucked under her arm. She carried an air of lightness, but her eyes betrayed worry. "Grandpa," she asked gently, "why was Dr. Simons here yesterday?" "Daddy said it was to check on you." Harold kept brushing the mare, his jaw tight. "Doctors have their place, Emmy, but sometimes they're asked to do more than heal." Emily tilted her head, frowning. "Like what?" "Like judge," Harold said, his voice low. "Like decide who's strong enough to stand and who should step aside." Emily set her sketchpad down. "But you are strong. I see you work every day." Harold turned, his eyes softening as he rested a hand on her shoulder. "That's why I need you to remember. No matter what anyone says, I'm not finished yet." She nodded, though confusion lingered in her young face. That evening, Richard sat in the study with Elaine and Ethan. Papers lay scattered across the desk, medical forms, property records, legal jargon Harold had never been meant to see. Richard tapped a pen against the desk. "Dr. Simons didn't commit, but I could tell he's leaning our way. If Dad stumbles even once in front of him, we'll have what we need." Elaine smirked, sipping her wine. "And Harold's pride will be his undoing. He'll fight until he collapses, and then—" Ethan cut in, tossing his ball against the wall with irritating rhythm. "Why drag it out? Just push harder. Make Grandpa prove himself. The more he strains, the quicker he'll break." Richard shot him a glare. "Watch your tone. This isn't a game." Ethan shrugged. "Feels like one to me." Elaine reached for Richard's hand, her eyes gleaming with ambition. "Think of the future, darling. A larger house, no more scraping by, no more hiding behind your father's shadow. Everything he denied you, all finally ours." Richard looked down at the papers, his expression torn. But greed was a slow poison, and it was already spreading. Days turned into weeks, and Harold noticed subtle shifts around the farm. Ethan was suddenly more involved, walking the grounds with a clipboard, jotting notes about repairs needed, livestock counts, equipment. Elaine supervised kitchen staff with the air of an heiress rather than a guest. One afternoon, Harold confronted Ethan near the tractor shed. "What are you doing with that clipboard?" Harold asked. Ethan smirked. "Inventory. Dad says we need to be prepared for the transition." Harold's brow furrowed. "Transition to what?" "To when you can't handle things anymore." The words cut deep. Harold's hand trembled on his cane, not from weakness but fury. "You arrogant pup! This farm doesn't bend to pen and paper, it bends to sweat, to sacrifice. Something you wouldn't know if it hit you in the face." Ethan leaned in, smirking. "Maybe it's time the farm bends to me." Before Harold could respond, Emily appeared, clutching her sketch pad to her chest. "Don't talk to Grandpa like that!" she snapped. Ethan rolled his eyes. "Stay out of it, kid!" Emily stood her ground, her voice quivering but fierce. "Grandpa knows more about this land than you ever will. He doesn't need your lists." Harold's chest swelled with pride at her defense, though he gently guided her away. Still, her courage gave him hope. Emily was his ally, his anchor in the storm. One evening, Richard approached Harold on the porch. The sky was painted with streaks of crimson and gold, the air heavy with cicadas' song. "Dad," Richard began carefully, "I've been talking to some advisors. They say it would be smart to transfer part of the farm to me now. It's just good planning." Harold chuckled bitterly. "Advisors, huh? Sounds like you've been listening to people who never set foot on this land." Richard's jaw tightened. "I'm trying to protect what's ours. What will happen if you fall ill? Or worse? Everything could get tangled in courts." Harold leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "You think I don't know how fragile time is? I've buried my wife, my brothers, half my friends. I know what's coming. But I'll be damned if I hand you the keys to destroy everything before I'm gone." Richard's face hardened, years of resentment bubbling beneath the surface. "You don't trust me! You never did!" Harold's voice softened, though laced with sorrow. "I trusted you once. When you were a boy, running barefoot through these fields. I thought you'd carry the torch. But somewhere along the way, you chose the darkness." Richard said nothing, but his silence was louder than words. He turned and walked away, his shadow stretching long across the porch. That night, Harold dreamed of Martha. She stood at the edge of the field, her dress fluttering in the wind, her face serene. "They're coming for you," she whispered. "But you must endure. For Emily." Harold reached out, but she vanished into mist. He woke in a sweat, his heart pounding. He knew then this wasn't just about land or money. It was a battle for legacy, for truth, for the soul of the family. And he couldn't fight it alone. The town of Millbrook was small enough that everyone knew each other's business, but large enough that rumors carried weight like fire in dry grass. By the time Harold walked into the feed store one crisp morning, he could already feel the sideways glances, the polite but pitying smiles. "Morning, Harold," old Mr. Turner said from behind the counter, his voice careful. "How are you holding up?" Harold narrowed his eyes. "Holding up? What's that supposed to mean?" Turner stammered. "Oh, nothing. Nothing at all. Just, heard you've had the doctor around. Folks were wondering if you were all right." Harold's gut twisted. He forced a nod, grabbed the bag of grain he needed, and left without another word. Outside, the autumn air bit cold against his skin, but it was nothing compared to the chill settling in his heart. Someone was talking, and Harold didn't need to guess who had lit the match. Back at the farmhouse, Elaine sat on the porch, sipping sweet tea as though she already owned the place. When Harold returned, she flashed her perfected smile. "Did you run into anyone in town?" she asked lightly. Too lightly. Harold didn't answer. He marched past her into the house, but Elaine's satisfied smirk lingered behind him. That evening, Richard invited Dr. Simons back under the guise of a routine checkup. Harold had barely finished supper when he saw the doctor's car crunching up the gravel drive. "What now?" Harold muttered, rising from his chair. Emily tugged at his sleeve. "Grandpa, don't let them trick you." Her little voice carried so much conviction that Harold almost laughed. "Don't worry, Emmy. I won't give them the satisfaction." In the living room, Richard poured coffee, while Elaine played the dutiful hostess. Dr. Simon sat uneasily, glancing between father and son. "Harold," Richard began, "we just want to make sure you're getting the best care. Nothing more, nothing less." Harold folded his arms. "And dragging a doctor here without my say is your idea of care?" "Dad," Richard pressed, his voice clipped with false concern. "This isn't an attack. We're worried. That fall in the barn last month. I tripped on a loose board not because I'm falling apart," Harold barked. Dr. Simons held up his hands. "Let's keep this calm. Mr. Whitaker, all I need is to ask you a few questions, routine memory checks, motor skills, nothing invasive." "No?" Harold glared at his son. "And if I refuse?" Elaine leaned forward, her tone syrupy sweet. "Then people might assume you have something to hide." The words hit Harold like a slap. He knew what she meant. If he didn't cooperate, they'd use his refusal as proof he was unfit. Grinding his teeth, Harold sat down. "Fine. Ask your questions. But don't expect me to play the fool." The test began. Dr. Simons asked Harold to recite the months of the year backward. Harold smirked and rattled them off with only one pause. He was asked to draw a clock on a blank sheet. He sketched it steady, though his hand trembled with anger, not weakness. But when the doctor asked him to recall 3 random words after a 5-minute distraction, Harold stumbled. He got 2 right, but the third slipped away like smoke. Richard's eyes flickered with triumph, and Elaine quickly masked her grin with a sip of coffee. "Not bad," Dr. Simon said, writing notes. "For your age, that's fairly typical." "Typical?" Richard echoed. "But not perfect, right?" Dr. Simons frowned. "I wouldn't read too much into a single lapse." But Harold could see where this was going. They would twist typical into incapable. Later, after the doctor left, Harold sat alone on the porch, staring into the dark. Emily crept out and sat beside him, her sketchpad balanced on her knees. "I drew something for you," she said quietly, handing him the page. It was a picture of the farmhouse, sturdy and tall, with Harold standing in front. His shoulders were broad, his face strong. Beside him was Emily, holding his hand. Harold's throat tightened. This is how you see me?" Emily nodded. "Strong. Like the farm. Even if Daddy says different." Harold blinked back tears. He hadn't cried in years, but Emily's faith in him cracked the armor he'd built. "Thank you, sweetheart," he whispered. "I needed that more than you know." Meanwhile, inside the house, Richard paced. Elaine lounged in a chair, filing her nails. "It's working," she said casually. "The doctor saw what we needed him to see. We just have to keep the pressure on." Richard ran a hand through his hair. "I don't know, Elaine. Dad's still sharp most of the time. If this goes to court, it might not hold." Elaine set her file down and fixed him with a piercing look. "Then we don't let it get to court. We convince him to sign papers before it comes to that. A little fear, a little persuasion, and he'll fold." Richard hesitated, torn between guilt and greed. But Ethan, who had been listening from the hallway, grinned. "I can help with that." Elaine arched a brow. "And what would you do?" Ethan smirked. "Push him. Remind him, every chance I get, that he's slipping. Make him question himself. People break faster when they start doubting their own mind." Richard didn't stop him, and that silence was its own betrayal. That night, Harold tossed in bed, Martha's voice echoing in his dreams again. "Endure. For Emily, don't let them take what we built. He woke with his fists clenched, a vow forming in his heart. If Richard wanted war, Harold was ready to fight. The leaves in Millbrook turned gold and copper, carpeting the ground around the farmhouse. What once felt like a season of harvest now carried the tension of something dying, something being taken away piece by piece. Harold noticed the changes creeping into his days. Ethan had stopped pretending to respect him. He strutted through the house like he owned it, tossing his muddy boots by the door, raiding the fridge without a word, blasting music upstairs. One evening, when Harold asked him to quiet down, Ethan snorted. "You don't run this place anymore, old man. Dad and Mom do." The words burned. Harold wanted to strike back, but Emily's wide eyes from the stairwell stopped him. Instead, he clenched his fists and walked away. But that night, lying awake, he thought, "If I stay silent much longer, they'll bury me alive while I'm still breathing." The next morning, Harold drove into town. The gravel roads stretched like old veins across farmland he knew better than his own hands. But this trip wasn't about errands, it was about finding someone who still believed him. His first stop was the church. Pastor Williams, a gentle man with silver hair, welcomed him in. "Harold, it's been a while," the pastor said warmly. "How are you holding up?" Harold sat heavily in a pew, his voice low. "Not well, Pastor. My own son's trying to take everything I've worked for. Claims I'm losing my mind." Pastor Williams frowned. "That's a heavy accusation. I've known you for decades, Harold. You're as sharp as ever." Harold's voice broke. "Tell that to the lawyer Richard hired. Tell that to Elaine, whispering poison into everyone's ear. They've even dragged the doctor into it." The pastor rested a hand on his shoulder. "Then you need witnesses, people who see you clearly, not through their lies. I'll stand for you if it comes to it." For the first time in weeks, Harold felt a flicker of strength. Someone still trusted him. Back at the farmhouse, Elaine and Richard weren't wasting time. Papers were spread across the dining table, forms, legal documents, drafts of a petition to declare Harold incapable of managing his own affairs. Elaine tapped her manicured nails against one stack. "Once these are filed, the court will have no choice but to consider guardianship. And given Dr. Simon's notes about Harold's memory lapse, we'll have leverage." Richard shifted uneasily. "But Dad, he's proud. If we push too hard." Elaine cut him off sharply. "Pride doesn't pay bills, Richard. That land could set us up for life. You want Ethan to have a future, don't you? Or do you prefer watching him struggle because your father clings to a dream he can't manage anymore?" Richard swallowed hard. He wanted to protest, but Ethan entered the room, grinning. "Grandpa's cracking already. I told him last night he doesn't run the house, and he just walked off. He's slipping." Elaine smiled coldly. "Good. Keep pressing. The more he doubts himself, the sooner he'll fold." Emily overheard this from the kitchen doorway, her small fists tightening. She didn't always understand the grown-up words, but she understood enough. They were trying to hurt Grandpa. She ran to Harold, who was sitting in the barn polishing his old tools. "Grandpa, they're planning something with papers. They said you'll lose the farm." Harold looked down at her, the sadness in his eyes tempered by a growing steel. "Then we'll have to be ready, won't we?" He hugged her tight, whispering, "Don't worry, Emmy. They won't win. Not if I have you by my side." The days grew colder, the air sharper. Rumors in town spread faster. People whispered that Harold was no longer himself, that he forgot things, that he was too frail to manage the land. One afternoon at the diner, Harold overheard two men at the counter. "Shame about old Harold," one said. "Heard his boys stepping in to handle the farm now." "Yeah," the other replied. "Guess it happens to all of us. Can't fight age forever." Harold's coffee turned bitter in his mouth. He set the cup down and left without finishing. Outside, his hands trembled, not from weakness, but from rage. That night, Emily found him sitting at the kitchen table, a ledger open before him. He had spread out decades of farm records, profits, harvests, expenses, meticulous notes in his own handwriting. "What are you doing, Grandpa?" she asked softly. "Proving I'm not done yet," Harold said firmly. "If they want to drag me into court, I'll show them the numbers. Every dollar, every bushel. This farm's still alive because of me, not in spite of me." Emily smiled, her faith in him unshaken. "Then I'll help. I can draw charts or copy numbers. Teacher says I'm good with neat writing." Harold chuckled, brushing a tear from his cheek. "You're my secret weapon, Emmy." But while Harold gathered his proof, Elaine and Richard gathered allies. They met with a lawyer in town, a man named Howard Drake. He was slick, ambitious, and all too willing to twist facts for the right price. "Guardianship cases are tricky," Drake said, adjusting his tie. "Courts don't like stripping rights unless there's clear evidence. But with medical notes, community testimony, and family statements, we can build a strong case, especially if he resists." Elaine's smile widened. "He will resist. But resistance can be painted as paranoia, can't it?" Drake's grin matched hers. "Exactly." Richard signed a retainer that night, the ink sealing not just a contract with a lawyer, but the deep betrayal of blood against blood. Back at the farmhouse, Harold finished his ledger and closed it with a firm hand. He looked at Emily and said, "They think I'm weak. They think I'm beaten. But tomorrow, we start fighting back." Emily's eyes sparkled with determination. "Together." Harold nodded. "Together." And for the first time in months, the farmhouse didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a battlefield, and Harold was ready to fight. The courthouse in Millbrook was a squat brick building that smelled faintly of varnish and dust. Harold hadn't set foot inside in years, not since he'd signed papers for a neighbor's land sale. Now, the place felt like an arena, and he was the one being dragged in as prey. Emily held his hand tightly as they entered. She wore her best dress yellow with tiny flowers because she believed that dressing nice showed respect. Harold straightened his old blazer, the same one he'd worn to Mary's funeral, and told himself he wouldn't bow his head today, not for anyone. But when they stepped into the courtroom, Harold saw Elaine already seated at the petitioner's table, elegant in a navy suit, Richard beside her, looking stiff in a tie, and Ethan lounging smugly behind them. Their lawyer, Howard Drake, exuded confidence as he shuffled his papers. It was clear they had prepared to win. The judge entered, a stern woman named Judge Martha Cole. She scanned the room, eyes sharp and unreadable. "This court will now hear the matter of guardianship regarding Mr. Harold Whitmore." The word stung like a slap. Guardianship. As if he were a child again, incapable of deciding when to eat or sleep. Drake stood first, his voice smooth and persuasive. "Your Honor, my clients, Richard and Elaine Whitmore, are here today out of deep concern for Mr. Whitmore's well-being. They have witnessed troubling lapses in memory, confusion, and instances that suggest he can no longer manage his affairs or his property safely. This petition for guardianship is not about control, it is about protection." Elaine dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, the picture of a grieving daughter-in-law. Richard kept his gaze fixed on the table, playing the role of the reluctant son forced into action. Then Drake called his first witness, Dr. Simons. The doctor adjusted his glasses nervously. Mr. Whitmore came in for a routine checkup. He forgot the date, mixed up some questions on a memory test. While this doesn't confirm dementia, it raised red flags. Given his age, it warrants monitoring. Drake pounced on the word flags. "Would you say these lapses could interfere with his ability to handle complex tasks, such as managing finances or property?" "Yes," Simons admitted reluctantly. "Potentially." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Harold's jaw clenched. Then came Ethan, strutting to the witness stand. He leaned back in the chair, smirking as if this were a stage play and he was the star. Grandpa forgets stuff all the time, Ethan said casually. He asked me the same question about the tractor 3 times in one day. He gets confused when paying bills. Honestly, it's sad to watch. I love him, but he's not himself anymore. Harold wanted to leap up and shout, "Liar!" But Emily squeezed his hand, her eyes wide, begging him to stay calm. Ethan's words stung worse than any stranger's could have. This was his grandson, the boy he had once carried on his shoulders across the very fields now in dispute. Finally, Drake called Elaine. She rose gracefully, her voice trembling in carefully measured tones. "We all love Harold, but he's stubborn. He refuses help, even when he struggles. He leaves the stove on, he misplaces important papers, and he won't listen when we suggest bringing in assistance. We only want what's best for him." In her performance was flawless, soft, concerned, dripping with sincerity. To anyone who didn't know her, she looked like a devoted daughter-in-law sacrificing her own comfort for an old man's safety. Harold could see some heads in the gallery nodding. The tide was turning against him. At last, it was his turn. Harold rose, his legs steady despite the storm raging inside him. He walked to the witness stand, removed his cap, and looked Judge Cole straight in the eyes. "I am not a child," he began firmly. "I've run my farm for 50 years. I raised my son under that roof. I buried my wife with my own hands beside the oak tree she loved. I've balanced the books, fixed every fence, planted every seed, and brought in every harvest. Alone, if I had to. Yes, I forget small things sometimes. Who doesn't? But I know the value of every acre of my land. I know the debts, the profits, the risks. And I know what's happening here." He turned, his eyes piercing Richard and Elaine. "This isn't about my health. This is about greed. They want what I've built. They want it before I'm gone." The courtroom stirred. Elaine's face tightened, her mask slipping for the briefest moment. Harold held up his ledger, thick with handwritten notes. "These are my records. Every dollar, every yield. Tell me, does that look like the work of a man who can't handle his affairs?" Judge Cole studied him carefully, her expression unreadable. Then, to everyone's surprise, Emily asked to speak. She was just a child, barely 10, but she stood with her chin high. "Please, Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling but brave. "My grandpa's the smartest man I know. He teaches me numbers, and he remembers stories from when he was my age. He never forgets the important things. He just needs people to believe in him." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Cole gazed at her for a long moment before nodding gently. "Thank you, young lady." Emily returned to Harold's side, clutching his arm like a shield. After hours of arguments, Judge Cole finally spoke. "This court recognizes that Mr. Whitmore has shown signs of mild forgetfulness. However, based on the evidence presented, including financial records and testimony, it is insufficient to declare him incapacitated at this time. The petition for guardianship is denied." Relief washed through Harold, but it was bittersweet. Elaine's eyes were ice, her smile brittle as glass. Richard looked humiliated, Ethan furious. The judge continued, "That said, I strongly recommend that Mr. Whitmore consider accepting assistance in managing his affairs voluntarily to prevent future concerns. This case may be revisited if further evidence arises." The gavel struck. The session was over. As Harold left the courthouse, the autumn sun blinding after the dim chamber, he felt Emily squeeze his hand. "We won, Grandpa," she whispered. "Yes," Harold said softly. "We won today. But this war's not over." Behind them, Elaine and Richard huddled with Drake, their whispers sharp as knives. The storm had only begun, and Harold knew the next strike would cut deeper than ever. The courthouse victory gave Harold only a brief sense of relief. By the time he and Emily returned home, the adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind a hollow ache in his chest. He won, but the warning in Judge Cole's words rang like a bell. This case may be revisited. That night, as Harold sat by the fireplace, the orange glow painting his lined face, he thought of the looks Elaine and Richard had exchanged in that courtroom. Not shame, not defeat. It was calculation. Like foxes shut out of the henhouse, already planning another way in. Emily curled up beside him, her head against his shoulder. "We're safe now, right, Grandpa?" she asked softly. Harold wrapped an arm around her, staring at the fire. He wanted to lie, to tell her yes, the storm had passed. But the truth sat heavy in his gut. Safe for now, sugar. But people like them don't quit. They just wait for another opening. Meanwhile, across town, Elaine poured herself a glass of wine in their polished kitchen. The house smelled of lemon polish and cold ambition. Richard sat at the counter, his tie loosened, his eyes fixed on the granite surface as though it might provide answers. "We should have won," Richard muttered. "We had the doctor, Ethan, everything lined up. That judge, she didn't see the truth." Elaine's laugh was bitter. "She saw through us, you mean?" Harold played the victim perfectly, and Emily. She slammed the glass down. "That girl ruined everything." Richard winced. "She's just a kid, Elaine. My daughter." "Exactly," Elaine snapped. And she stood up for him. "Not you. Don't you see? As long as Harold has her, he has a weapon. A sweet little face that makes the court pity him. We can't let that happen again." Richard looked at her uneasily. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we need a new strategy. Guardianship was too blunt. We need leverage. Something that forces Harold to his knees." The next day, Harold noticed small things that fueled his unease. A black sedan idled down the road longer than usual. A man he didn't recognize walked the perimeter of the fields, pretending to check a map. He found the latch on his barn door unhooked, though he was sure he'd secured it. Emily didn't notice, she was too busy feeding the chickens and chattering about school. But Harold's instincts, honed by decades of protecting his farm, told him something was off. That evening, he sat at the kitchen table, ledger open, pen in hand, but his mind wasn't on the numbers. He was thinking about Elaine's words in court, about Ethan's betrayal. The family he'd worked his whole life to provide for was circling him like vultures. What more can they take, he wondered, and what will they destroy in the process? Elaine wasted no time. She invited Ethan to dinner the following week, her voice sweet and coaxing as she set her plan in motion. "You did so well in court," she purred, serving him roast beef. "The judge may not have listened, but your testimony was strong. You're a bright young man, Ethan. You deserve recognition for that." Ethan smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Didn't feel like it mattered. Grandpa's old man speech swayed them more than I did." "That's because Harold has Emily," Elaine said smoothly. "But that can change. Think about it. If Emily weren't there, if Harold didn't have that sweet little defender, he'd crumble. He'd have no shield." Ethan's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "You're saying what exactly?" Elaine leaned closer, lowering her voice. "I'm saying, if Harold were forced to manage without Emily, he'd show his true weakness, and the court would see him for what he is." Richard looked uneasy. "Elaine," but Ethan grinned. "Maybe you're right. Grandpa relies on her too much. He should be the one looking after her, not the other way around." Elaine smiled, satisfied. The seed had been planted. Back at the farmhouse, Harold lay awake long past midnight. The house creaked, the wind rattled the shutters, and still he couldn't sleep. He thought of Mary, of how she would have known what to do, her calm voice cutting through the storm. He whispered into the darkness, "I need you, Mary. I can't fight them alone." Beside his bed, the old photo of her seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight, her smile frozen in time. It gave him no answers, only a reminder of what he was fighting for. Down the hall, Emily slept soundly, clutching her stuffed rabbit. She trusted him to protect her, to keep the wolves at bay. But Harold feared the wolves were already at the door. A week later, it began. Emily's school called Harold in the middle of the morning. The principal's voice was polite but firm. "Mr. Whitmore, we've had concerns raised about Emily's living conditions. There's been a report suggesting she may not be safe at your farm. Social services will need to conduct a home visit." Harold froze. "What? Who said that? My farm's safe, safer than most homes in this county." "I understand, sir," the principal said gently. "But we're required by law to investigate. Expect a visit soon." When Harold hung up, his hands trembled with rage. He didn't need to ask who had made the report. Elaine's fingerprints were all over it. Emily noticed his distress at lunch. "Grandpa, what's wrong?" Harold forced a smile. "Nothing you need to worry about, sugar. Just some busybodies poking their noses where they don't belong." But inside, his fury burned. They weren't just coming for his land anymore. Now, they were coming for the one person he loved most. The knock on the farmhouse door came on a Wednesday afternoon. It was sharp, official, the kind of knock that carried authority. Harold rose slowly from his chair, his knees aching, his heart pounding. Emily looked up from her homework at the kitchen table. "Grandpa? Who is it?" "Stay there, sugar," Harold said, steadying his voice. He crossed the room and opened the door. A woman stood on the porch, her expression polite but detached. She wore a navy blazer and carried a leather folder tucked under one arm. Her badge glinted in the light. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm Karen Daniels, Child Protective Services. May I come in?" Harold's jaw tightened. He stepped aside reluctantly. "I suppose you must." Emily shrank back in her chair, her wide eyes flicking between Harold and the stranger. Karen entered, scanning the room with a practiced eye, taking in the tidy kitchen, the bookshelves, the faint scent of wood smoke. She smiled briefly at Emily. "Hello, sweetheart. And you must be Emily?" Emily nodded shyly, clutching her pencil. Harold gestured toward the table. "You'll want to sit, I reckon. Let's get this circus underway." Karen sat and opened her folder. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm here to follow up on a report suggesting that Emily's living environment may not be suitable. I'm required to assess the home and interview both of you." Harold leaned on the counter, arms crossed. "And who made that report? Elaine, wasn't it? Or maybe that son of mine who's too busy making deals to raise his own child." Karen's expression didn't change. "I'm not at liberty to disclose the source. I'm here only to gather facts." The interview began. Karen asked questions in a calm, steady tone, the kind that might soothe some families but only stoked Harold's irritation. "Do you have running water? Heat? Adequate sleeping arrangements for Emily?" Harold bristled. "This farm's been standing 100 years. It's provided for 3 generations. Emily's got her own room, clean sheets, and more fresh food than most city kids ever see." Karen made notes without comment. When she turned to Emily, Harold's chest tightened. "Emily, do you feel safe living here with your grandfather?" Karen asked gently. Emily looked at Harold, then back at Karen. "Of course I do. Grandpa takes care of me. He makes breakfast every morning, helps me with my homework, and he reads me stories at night." Her small voice grew firmer. "This is my home. I don't want to live anywhere else." Karen studied her, then scribbled another note. After the questions, Karen asked to see the house. Harold led her room to room, pointing out the newly mended roof, the sturdy locks, the pantry stocked with jars of canned vegetables. She peeked into Emily's room, where the bed was neatly made and the shelves lined with books and stuffed animals. "It's very tidy," Karen said. "Emily, do you clean your room yourself?" "Yes, ma'am," Emily said proudly. "Grandpa says if I can take care of my space, I can take care of anything." Karen gave a faint smile. "That's a good lesson." Still, Harold saw her jot down something else in her notes. By the time she closed her folder, Harold's patience was thin as rope frayed by the wind. "So, what happens now?" he asked. "I'll file a report," Karen said, rising. "If concerns persist, there may be follow-up visits. For now, Emily remains here with you. But I do advise addressing any potential hazards. For example, I notice the steps to the porch are a bit loose." Harold grunted. "I'll fix 'em." Karen nodded politely. "Thank you for your time." When the door closed behind her, Harold sagged into a chair, his shoulders heavy. Emily ran to him, her face pale. "Grandpa, are they going to take me away?" she whispered. Harold pulled her close, his voice rough. "Not while I've got breath in my body. They'll have to drag me out of here before they lay a hand on you." That night, Harold couldn't sleep. He paced the living room, staring out the window at the dark fields. Somewhere out there, Elaine was smiling, satisfied with the trouble she'd stirred. He imagined her pouring another glass of wine, laughing about the visit. Richard sitting silent, avoiding his eyes. Ethan sneering, thinking he'd scored another point against the old man. "Cowards!" Harold muttered under his breath. But he also knew the system had teeth. If Elaine pushed hard enough, if CPS came back with more questions, the court might reconsider. The judge's warning echoed again in his head. This case may be revisited. Across town, Elaine did pour herself a glass of wine. She sat with Richard in their immaculate living room, her heels kicked off, satisfaction radiating from her. "Well?" Richard asked quietly. "Did the visit happen?" Elaine smirked. "Of course. And it's only the beginning. Once CPS has a file on him, we'll have leverage. He can't shout his way out of this one." Richard frowned. Emily didn't say anything against him, did she? Elaine waved a dismissive hand. "She's a child. They'll believe an adult's report over her words. All we need is persistence. We keep applying pressure until Harold cracks." Richard looked away, guilt flickering in his eyes. But Elaine leaned forward, her smile sharp. "Mark my words, Richard, by the time we're finished, that farm will be ours. And Harold will be nothing more than a bitter old man with no one left to fight for him." Back at the farmhouse, Harold finally sat at his desk, staring at the old family Bible. Inside were pressed flowers from Mary's garden, notes in the margins, a record of births and deaths written in faded ink. He ran his hand over Mary's handwriting and whispered, "They want to tear us apart, Mary. But I won't let them. I'll hold this family together, even if it kills me." In her sleep, Emily stirred and murmured softly, as if in response, "I love you, Grandpa." And in that moment, Harold's resolve hardened like stone. The next morning, Harold was already outside before dawn, hammer in hand. The sound of nails driving into wood echoed across the fields as he repaired the loose porch steps. Sweat ran down his brow despite the chill in the air. Emily stood at the window, watching. She could tell when Grandpa was angry, not because he shouted, but because he worked harder. He attacked each task like it was an enemy that needed beating. By the time the sun crept over the horizon, the steps were solid as stone. Harold wiped his hands on his jeans, breathing hard, and muttered, "Let's see CPS call this place unsafe now." At breakfast, Emily asked carefully, "Grandpa, Are we going to be okay? Harold gave her a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. We'll be fine, sugar, long as we stick together. But deep down, Harold knew sticking together wasn't enough. He had to show the world that this farm wasn't just four walls and a roof, it was a home. That afternoon, he called in favors. Old friends from church came by with fresh paint, a neighbor dropped off lumber, and even the mailman helped carry supplies. Word spread through town that Harold was fighting to keep Emily, and folks rallied behind him. By the end of the week, the farmhouse gleamed with new life. Freshly painted shutters, repaired fencing, a swing set in the yard for Emily. When Emily ran outside to play on the swing, her laughter carried through the air. Harold leaned on the porch railing, pride swelling in his chest. For the first time in weeks, hope felt real. But across town, Elaine's bitterness deepened. She drove past the farm one evening and saw the fresh paint, the cars parked out front, the sound of neighbors laughing and hammering. Her nails dug into the steering wheel. He's turning them against me, she hissed. Ethan, sitting in the passenger seat, smirked. Relax, Mom. We still have the upper hand. CPS is watching him now. One slip up, and he's done. Elaine narrowed her eyes. Then we make sure he slips. A week later, trouble came knocking again. Harold had just returned from the fields when he noticed something odd. Two empty beer bottles tossed near the porch, and cigarette butts scattered across the yard. His stomach tightened. He didn't drink, and neither did Emily. He picked up the bottles, sniffed them, and swore under his breath. They're trying to make this place look unfit. That night, he bolted the doors and double-checked the locks. But when he peeked out the window, he thought he saw a figure lingering at the edge of the property line just beyond the reach of the porch light. Ethan. Harold clenched his fists, but he didn't step outside. Not yet. The next day, Karen Daniels returned for another inspection. She frowned when she spotted the cigarette butts near the porch. Mr. Whitmore, are you aware of these? She asked. Harold's voice was tight. Those weren't here yesterday. Someone's planting them. Karen gave him a measured look. Mr. Whitmore, I have to document what I see. I suggest ensuring the premises remain clear of such items. Emily tugged at Harold's sleeve. It wasn't us, Miss Karen. Grandpa doesn't even smoke. Please believe me. Karen softened, but her pen kept moving across the page. When she left, Harold slammed the door harder than he meant to. Emily flinched. He knelt beside her immediately, his voice gentler. I'm sorry, sugar. I'm just tired of their games. Emily nodded and hugged him. I believe you, Grandpa. That's all that matters. But Harold knew it wasn't enough. Elaine and Ethan were clever, and the system was stacked in their favor. He needed more than patched steps and fresh paint. He needed proof. That evening, he drove into town and bought an old security camera system from the hardware store. It took him hours to install, wires snaking across the porch and into the living room. But by midnight, the cameras were live. Let's see you try and sneak around now, he muttered. Emily peeked over his shoulder at the monitor. Like a spy movie, she said with a grin. Harold chuckled for the first time in days. That's right, sugar. We're going to catch our bad guys red-handed. Meanwhile, Elaine and Ethan were plotting their next move over dinner. CPS is already suspicious, Ethan said. If they see enough red flags, they'll pull her out of there for sure. Elaine swirled her wine glass. But we can't be sloppy. Harold's not stupid. If he's setting traps, we need something he can't wriggle out of. Ethan leaned forward, eyes glinting. Then let's give them something bigger. What if we make it look like he's neglecting Emily? Maybe she wanders off, gets seen somewhere alone. Elaine's lips curved into a cold smile. Yes, something dramatic, something the court can't ignore. Richard, sitting silently at the table, slammed his fork down suddenly. Both Elaine and Ethan stared at him. "Enough," Richard said, his voice low but sharp. "You're talking about framing my father, about hurting Emily. Have you lost your minds?" Elaine's eyes narrowed. "Richard, don't be dramatic. No one's hurting anyone. We're protecting Emily from an unstable old man." But Richard stood, pushing his chair back. You're protecting yourself. Your greed. I won't let you destroy him." He stormed out, leaving Elaine and Ethan glaring at each other. For the first time, cracks appeared in their alliance. Back at the farmhouse, Harold tucked Emily into bed, then sat alone in the living room, watching the security monitors flicker. Outside, the night was quiet. Too quiet. He whispered into the silence, "Come on, you snakes. I'm ready for you." And though the farmhouse stood still in the moonlight, Harold felt the storm gathering just beyond the horizon. The following nights were restless ones. Harold slept lightly, always half aware of the flickering monitors in the corner of the living room. Each creak of the farmhouse made him tense. Each gust of wind tapping the window made him sit upright. But 3 nights later, his vigilance paid off. It was well past midnight when Harold's eyes fluttered open. On the monitor, movement registered on the front porch camera. He leaned forward, heart pounding. A shadowy figure crept along the porch, crouched low near the steps. The grainy footage showed a man pulling something from his jacket pocket beer bottles. Harold's jaw tightened. "Ethan!" The man placed the bottles carefully near the railing, glancing around nervously before scattering cigarette butts like seeds. He smirked toward the camera, unaware of its presence, and slipped back into the night. Harold exhaled slowly, relief mixing with rage. "Got you," he whispered. The next morning, Emily found Harold at the kitchen table, replaying the footage. Her eyes widened. "That's Ethan. He's the one trying to trick Miss Karen." Harold nodded grimly. "And now we have proof." He burned the footage to a thumb drive, tucked it in his shirt pocket, and drove into town. This time, when Karen Daniels greeted him at the CPS office, Harold's voice carried none of the weary defeat she was used to. He placed the drive on her desk. "Before you write another word about my home, you're going to see this," he said. Karen raised a brow but plugged it into her computer. As the footage played, her expression shifted from skepticism to shock, then to anger. "This is Ethan?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Harold replied. "My own son. And Elaine is behind him. They're trying to make me look unfit so they can take Emily and the land." Karen sat back in her chair, lips pressed tightly. "Mr. Whitmore, this changes everything. Not only is this clear evidence of harassment, but it's also a serious attempt to manipulate CPS. I'll have to escalate this immediately." For the first time in weeks, Harold felt the weight on his chest lighten. But word traveled fast in small towns. That evening, Elaine received a phone call that made her blood run cold. "What do you mean he has footage?" She snapped into the phone. On the other end, Ethan's voice shook. "I didn't know he had cameras, Mom. He's got me on tape planting the bottles." Elaine paced the living room, her heels clicking against the hardwood. "You fool. Do you realize what this means? If CPS reports this to the court, we could lose everything." Ethan swallowed hard. "Then we have to hit back harder. Make him look crazy. Make them believe the video was doctored." Elaine stopped pacing. Her eyes burned with fury, but also calculation. "Number. We'll spin it differently. We'll say he's framing us out of desperation." Ethan frowned. "And what about Richard? He's already suspicious of us." Elaine's voice dropped like a blade. "Then we silence him too. One way or another." Meanwhile, Richard was pacing his own apartment. His conscience gnawed at him. He had kept quiet for too long, letting Elaine and Ethan scheme while his father struggled alone. But now, with evidence in Harold's hands, Richard knew it was time to choose a side. He picked up his phone and dialed. "Dad, we need to talk." The next day, Richard arrived at the farmhouse. Emily ran to greet him, though her smile was cautious. She still remembered his harsh words from weeks ago. Richard knelt and hugged her. "I'm sorry, Emily. I should have protected you sooner." Harold stepped onto the porch, arms crossed. His face was hard, but his eyes betrayed a glimmer of hope. "What do you want, Richard?" Richard swallowed. "I want to help. Mom and Ethan, they've gone too far. If you'll let me, I'll stand with you." Harold studied his son for a long moment. The silence stretched heavy between them. Finally, he nodded. "If you're serious, then it's time you start telling the truth." Richard nodded quickly. "Whatever it takes." That night, the farmhouse felt lighter somehow. For the first time in years, Harold and Richard sat at the same table, eating supper together with Emily. She smiled so wide, it lit up the whole room. But even as laughter returned, Harold couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Elaine was many things: vengeful, bitter, cunning, but never a quitter. She would strike again, and when she did, Harold knew it would be with everything she had left. Across town, Elaine stood by the window of her darkened house, staring out into the night. Her reflection in the glass looked sharp and hollow, her eyes hard. She raised her glass of wine and whispered to herself, "If Harold thinks one little video will save him, he's more naive than I thought. This isn't over, not by a long shot." She drained the glass, her mind already sharpening the next blade she would send his way. The farmhouse was quiet again. Too quiet. For the past 2 nights, Harold slept deeper than he had in months, knowing Karen from CPS now had the footage. Emily laughed more freely, and Richard kept his promise, helping around the farm, listening to his father's guidance, slowly mending broken trust. But Harold's instincts whispered otherwise. A storm was coming. 3 days later, it arrived. Harold was hauling feed to the barn when Richard came running, breathless, waving an envelope. "Dad, this was left in the mailbox, no stamp, no name." Harold wiped his hands on his jeans and opened it. His stomach clenched. Inside were photographs, grainy, black and white stills, showing him in the kitchen at night, asleep in his chair, Emily playing in the yard, Richard walking up the driveway. All taken through windows. Someone had been watching them. Emily peeked at the photos and gasped. "Grandpa, someone was spying on us?" Harold shoved the photos back into the envelope, jaw tight. "Not someone. Elaine." That evening, Richard sat with Harold at the table, anger written across his face. "She's escalating, Dad. She wants to scare us." Harold nodded grimly. "She's trying to push me into doing something reckless. If I lash out, she wins." Richard's hands balled into fists. "Then let me handle Ethan. He listens to her, but maybe he'll back down if I—" "No," Harold cut him off firmly. "That path only drags us down to her level. We stay steady, we fight clean." But Elaine wasn't finished. 2 days later, Karen Daniels called Harold. Her tone was sharp, professional, but layered with unease. "Mr. Whitmore, I don't know how to tell you this, but a video was submitted to my office. It claims to show you shouting at Emily, threatening her. It was mailed anonymously." Harold felt the air leave his chest. "That's a lie." "I know," Karen said quickly. "I've worked with you too long now to believe it. But understand, if Elaine escalates further, she could sway someone less familiar with the case. Do you have any idea how far she's willing to go?" Harold's silence was answer enough. Meanwhile, Elaine was unraveling. She sat in her dimly lit living room, replaying the doctored video she and Ethan had pieced together from spliced audio clips and blurred images. She smirked at the illusion, but her hands shook as she poured more wine. "Dad's finished," Ethan said, leaning against the doorway. "One push, and the system will take Emily away for good." Elaine glared at him. "Don't underestimate Harold. He's always been stubborn. But this time, I'll make sure he never crawls out from under." Her voice cracked with venom. "He took my life, my years, my freedom. I'll take what he loves most." The final blow came the following week. Emily had gone out to the barn with Richard to feed the animals when Harold heard a car crunching up the gravel drive. He stepped out onto the porch and froze. Elaine climbed out, dressed sharply in a tailored coat, her lips painted blood red. Ethan followed behind her, smirking. Harold's heart thudded. "What do you want?" Elaine strode forward, eyes blazing. "What's mine? You think one little video will undo me? You think Karen Daniels believes you're some saintly grandfather? You're finished, Harold. And when the courts see my evidence, Emily will be mine." Harold squared his shoulders. "You'll never have her. Not while I'm breathing." Elaine's laugh was brittle, cold. "Then maybe that can be arranged." Ethan stepped closer, chest puffed out, eyes wild with arrogance. "Dad, you've already lost. The land, the girl, even Richard, none of it's really yours. It's all slipping through your fingers." Richard's voice rang out from behind them. "You're wrong." He and Emily stood in the barn doorway, Emily clutching his hand. Richard walked forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Harold. "We're done being afraid of you, both of you." Elaine's eyes darted between father and son, realization dawning that her hold on Richard was truly gone. Her smirk faltered. "You'll regret this," she hissed, but her voice wavered. "No, Mom," Richard said firmly. "The only one who should regret anything is you." The confrontation ended not with fists, but with a call. Harold dialed Karen Daniels, handing her the phone as Elaine ranted. Karen's steady voice cut through the chaos. "Mrs. Whitmore, you are under investigation for falsifying evidence and harassment. I suggest you leave this property immediately before law enforcement gets involved." Elaine's face drained of color. Ethan tugged at her arm, muttering, "Let's go, Mom!" But Elaine wrenched free, glaring at Harold one last time. "This isn't over." Harold held her gaze, voice steady. "Yes, Elaine, it is." As her car disappeared down the drive, Emily clung to Harold's arm. "Grandpa, are we safe now?" Harold pulled her close, looking at Richard with tired but proud eyes. "We will be, sweetheart, because we stand together. That's something they can't take from us." The farmhouse seemed to exhale after Elaine's car vanished down the gravel road. For the first time in months, the night felt still. No shadows lurking outside, no threats hanging unspoken in the air. Yet Harold knew it wasn't over, not until Elaine's lies were exposed to the world. The next morning, Karen Daniels arrived at the farm with 2 sheriff's deputies. She laid her files across the kitchen table. The authentic video footage Richard had captured, the doctored recordings Elaine had sent, and the photographs left in Harold's mailbox. "Elaine made one mistake too many," Karen said firmly. "Tampering with evidence, stalking, and filing false claims, it's a pattern we can prove. This time, the law is on your side." Richard leaned forward, eyes sharp. "And Ethan?" Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "He's complicit. If he keeps shielding his mother, he'll face charges as well." Emily sat beside Harold, her hand wrapped around his. "Grandpa, does this mean we can finally be safe?" Harold brushed a strand of hair from her face. His voice was steady, though inside he trembled with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "Yes, sweetheart. It means we can finally breathe again." The hearing took place 2 weeks later in the small county courthouse. Elaine arrived in her polished suit, makeup flawless, every gesture rehearsed the image of a wronged mother. Ethan trailed behind, head down, refusing to meet Harold's eyes. But when Karen Daniels presented the unaltered footage alongside the doctored clips Elaine had manufactured, the courtroom stirred. Gasps rippled through the benches as the contrast became clear. One was truth, raw and undeniable. The other a fabrication dripping with malice. "Mrs. Whitmore," the judge said sternly, peering over his glasses, "do you deny creating or submitting this falsified evidence?" Elaine's painted lips trembled. For once, no words came. The gavel struck. The court ruled in Harold's favor, full guardianship of Emily, and a restraining order against Elaine. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Elaine shoved past them, her mask cracking as flashes lit her face. Harold, meanwhile, stood tall with Richard and Emily at his side. His hands still shook, but not from fear, from the weight lifting off his shoulders. Emily tugged his sleeve. "Grandpa, can we go home now?" Home. The word had never sounded so sweet. Life on the farm slowly returned to rhythm. Mornings were filled with chores and the smell of bacon sizzling on the stove. Richard worked the fields with a renewed sense of purpose, learning not just the mechanics of farming but the deeper lessons. Harold passed down patience, endurance, the value of honest hands. Emily flourished, her laughter no longer edged with fear. She painted the barn doors bright red, declaring it our new start. And Harold? He allowed himself something he hadn't felt in decades: peace. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the rolling fields, Harold sat on the porch with Richard. They shared a quiet drink, watching Emily chase fireflies across the yard. Richard broke the silence first. "Dad, I don't know how to make up for all the years I let her poison me against you." Harold looked at his son, truly looked at him. For the first time, he saw not the boy who left, not the man who stumbled, but a father standing tall beside his daughter. "You don't have to make up for it, son," Harold said softly. "You just have to keep showing up. That's more than enough." Richard's throat tightened. He nodded, unable to speak, but Harold understood. Later that night, Emily crawled into Harold's lap with a book. "Grandpa, do you think Grandma will ever stop being angry?" Harold kissed the top of her head. "Maybe one day, but anger like that, it only hurts the one who carries it. We don't have to let it hurt us anymore." Emily snuggled closer, whispering, "I'm glad I have you." Tears burned Harold's eyes as he held her close. "I'm glad I have you too, sweetheart. You saved me as much as I saved you." Seasons turned. The farm thrived again, not from wealth, but from love stitched back into its soil. Elaine faded into the background, her bitterness a shadow no longer looming over their days. Ethan, too, eventually distanced himself from her, quietly reaching out to Richard months later, tentative, remorseful, seeking a sliver of the family he'd nearly destroyed. Harold welcomed it with cautious grace. Forgiveness wasn't easy, but it was freedom. On a crisp autumn morning, Harold stood at the fence line, watching Emily and Richard laughing as they loaded pumpkins onto the truck for market. His heart swelled. The years had been cruel, but the land had taught him well. Even the harshest winters give way to spring. For the first time in a long time, Harold Whitmore believed in tomorrow. And this time, tomorrow belonged to them all.